When trying to win an argument, most people default to the obvious: talking. There are two typical strategies for that. First, there are folks who are aggressive with their words. They'll charge right into their opponent. They'll throw arguments like bombs. They'll quote facts, negotiate assumptions, and corner you until you're left speechless with no other choice but to agree with them. Other people have different strategies. They won't use merit to convince you. Rather, they'll rely on emotional manipulation. They'll bring up only remotely relevant examples and position themselves as victims. Then, they will guilt trip you into compliance by making you feel bad if you didn't. These two strategies seem like effective ways to win an argument. However, they rarely lead to constructive discussions. That's because people who use them aren't interested in them. More than anything, they just want to prove they're right. The question of how to win an argument is really a question of validating themselves. But that's no way to initiate a meaningful discussion or solve a conflict. Luckily, there's another strategy you can use if you want to learn how to win an argument. Counterintuitively, it demands you to speak less, not more. The first thing you should do is ask how rather than why. Thanks to the illusion of explanatory depth, many political arguments will be based on false premises, spoken with great confidence but with a minimal understanding of the issues at hand. For this reason, a simple but powerful way of deflating someone's argument is to ask for more detail. You need to get the other side focusing on how something would play itself out in a step-by-step fashion. Revealing the shallowness of their existing knowledge prompts a more moderate and humble attitude. In 2013, Professor Philip Fernbach at the University of Colorado Boulder and colleagues asked participants in cap-and-trade schemes designed to limit companies' carbon emissions to describe in depth how they worked. Subjects initially took strongly polarized views, but after the limits of their knowledge were exposed, their attitudes became more moderate and less biased. It's important to note that simply asking why people supported or opposed their policy without requiring them to explain how it works had no effect, since those reasons could be shallower. It helps the environment with little detail. You need to ask how something works to get the effect. If you're debating the merits of a no-deal Brexit, you might ask someone to describe exactly how the UK's international trade would change under World Trade Organization terms. If you're challenging a climate emergency denier, you might ask them to describe exactly how their alternative theories can explain the recent rise in temperatures. It's a strategy that the broadcaster James O'Brien employs to powerful effect. The second thing you should do is fill their knowledge gap with a convincing story. If you're trying to debunk a particular falsehood, like a conspiracy theory or fake news, you should make sure that your explanation offers a convincing, coherent narrative that fills all the gaps left in the other person's understanding. Consider the following experiment by Professor Brendan Nyhan of the University of Michigan and Professor Jacob Reifler of the University of Exeter. Subjects read stories about a fictional senator allegedly under investigation for bribery, who had subsequently resigned from his post. Written evidence, a letter from prosecutors confirming his innocence, did little to change the participants' suspicions of his guilt. But when offered an alternative explanation for his resignation, to take on another role, participants changed their minds. The same can be seen in murder trials. People are more likely to accept someone's innocence if another suspect has also been accused, since that fills the biggest gap in the story. The persuasive power of well-constructed narratives means that it's often useful to discuss the sources of misinformation so that the person can understand why they were being misled in the first place. Anti-vaxxers, for instance, may believe a medical conspiracy to cover up the supposed dangers of vaccines. You are more likely to change minds if you replace that narrative with an equally cohesive and convincing story. The third thing you should do is reframe the issue. Each of our beliefs is deeply rooted in a much broader and more complex political ideology. Climate crisis denial, for instance, is now inextricably linked to beliefs in free trade, capitalism, and the dangers of environmental regulation. Attacking one issue may therefore threaten to unravel someone's whole worldview. a feeling that triggers emotionally charged motivated reasoning. It's for this reason that highly educated Republicans in the US deny the overwhelming evidence. You're not going to alter someone's whole political ideology in one discussion. So, a better strategy is to disentangle the issue at hand from their broader beliefs, or to explain how the facts can still be accommodated into their worldview. A free market capitalist who denies global warming might be far more receptive to the evidence if you explain that the development of renewable energies could lead to technological breakthroughs and generate economic growth. The fourth thing you should do is appeal to an alternative identity. If the attempt to reframe the issue fails, you might have more success by appealing to another part of the person's identity entirely. Someone's political affiliation will never completely define them after all. Besides being a conservative or a socialist, a Brexiter or a Remainer, we associate ourselves with other traits and values, things like our profession or our role as a parent. We might see ourselves as a particularly honest person or someone who's especially creative. All people have multiple identities. These identities can become active at any given time depending on the circumstances. You're more likely to achieve your aims by arguing gently and kindly. You'll also come across better to onlookers. It's natural that when talking about politics, the salient identity will be our support for a particular party or movement. But when people are asked to first reflect on their other non-political values, they tend to become more objective in discussion on highly partisan issues as they stop viewing facts through their ideological lens. You could try to use this to your advantage during a heated conversation with subtle flattery that appeals to another identity and its set of values. If you're talking to a science teacher, you might try to emphasize their capacity to appraise evidence even-handedly. The aim is to help them recognize that they can change their mind on certain issues while staying true to other important elements of their personality. The fifth thing you should do is persuade them to take an outside perspective. Another simple strategy to encourage a more detached and rational mindset is to ask your conversation partner to imagine the argument from the viewpoint of someone who is totally different or is an outsider. Psychological distance from the issue at hand cools emotionally charged reasoning so that you can see things more objectively. During the US presidential elections, for instance, their participants were asked to consider how someone in Iceland would view the candidates. They were subsequently more willing to accept the limits of their knowledge and to listen to alternative viewpoints. This is only one way to increase someone's psychological distance, and there are many others. If you're considering policies with potentially long-term consequences, you could ask them to imagine viewing the situation through the eyes of someone in the future. However you do it, encouraging this shift in perspective should make your friend or relative more receptive to the facts you're presenting, rather than simply reacting with dismissals. When all of the above options don't seem to be working, you should opt to be kind. Here's a lesson that might do well to remember. People are generally more rational in their arguments and more willing to own up to the limits of their knowledge and understanding if they're treated with respect and compassion. Aggression, by contrast, leads them to feel that their identity is threatened, which in turn can make them closed-minded. Assuming that the purpose of your argument is to change minds rather than to signal your own superiority, you're much more likely to achieve your aims by arguing gently and kindly rather than belligerently and affirming your respect for the person, even if you are telling them some hard truths. As a bonus, you will also come across better to onlookers. There's a lot of work showing that third-party observers always attribute high levels of competence when the person is conducting themselves with more civility. Civility costs nothing and buys everything. That's it for the video. If you enjoyed it, kindly like the video and subscribe to our channel.